Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. Our goal is to get to the root issues of systemic problems using a theological and psychological lens. We hope you enjoy. Great conversations don't happen by accident. They're made possible by organizations that believe people deserve hope, healing, and access to resources that change lives. We're grateful for our premier sponsors, Wellness by Dr. Natalia and Uprising Addiction Center. Wellness by Dr. Natalia provides a personalized approach to healthcare through concierge and integrative medicine, helping patients take a proactive approach to their health and well-being. Uprising Addiction Center is committed to helping individuals and families break free from addiction through compassionate, evidence-based care and support. Their team is dedicated to helping people find hope, healing, and a path forward towards lasting recovery. To learn more about our sponsors and the service they provide, click the links below. And now let's get to today's conversation. Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. Today we're excited to welcome back Dr. Dwyer from LSU. Dr. Dwyer is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral medicine and vice chair of research at LSU Health Shreveport with more than 30 years of research experience, including working at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. He's devoted his career to advancing our understanding of neuroscience, genetics, and mental health. He's back today to discuss his newly published manuscript, Suicide Risk Genes, the questions that inspired it, and what his latest findings could mean for both science and clinical practice. Dr. Dwyer, welcome back to Asking Why.
Oh, it's nice to be here, Clint.
Yeah, had a great time with you guys last time.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can do that again today.
Well, let's do it. Yeah, so tell us about this new research that you've been doing. I mean, I'm definitely interested. I told you I was excited to talk about it before. When we look at suicidality and we look at how that has grown in the last 10 to 14 years, especially in teens. But, I mean, suicide has always been a problem for men.
Right.
From the ages of 44 and up, that 4 times more likely to kill themselves than kill somebody else. All of this research that we see. Tell us about what led you to writing about this and researching it and all that.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, this is something that we actually stumbled across. I've been working on genetics related to psychiatric disorders, things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. And the model system, so part of the work we do is looking through databases and looking at the genes that have been turned up in what are called genome-wide association studies, where they sequence the whole genome, person's whole genome, find markers that elevate, if you have that marker, it elevates your risk for schizophrenia, what have you. Mm-hmm. Same is true for suicide, strong genetic component. But the other thing I do besides the genetics and database searching, that type of research, is I use a model organism called Caenorhabditis elegans, or C. elegans. And this is a microscopic soil nematode. And you think, how can that pertain to this? And I'll get there in a moment. And you can interrupt me with questions anywhere along the way.
That's great.
But
I don't know what any of that means, but
Yeah, so this is just a roundworm that's found in the soil. You have to look at it under the microscope. It turned out to be a great genetic model because it for reasons too lengthy to go into here, but it's a great genetic model. So we've been using that in the lab.
What do you mean by genetic model?
So it's
Tell me who doesn't know what you're talking about, and the listener what you're doing exactly and how. I know you said lengthy, but I mean I'm here for it.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll shut you up if we go too far. But
okay, please feel free to.
Yeah.
So by that I mean that if you want to do manipulations of mice, let's say, they are outbred, even inbred strains of mice, you have to do breeding, which takes time, making the changes in their genetic makeup is difficult to do. It's become easier and easier, but when this system was developed back in the 1960s and 70s, all that was difficult to impossible to do in any other organism.
And so we're doing that with mice so that we can then project that onto human beings and figure out.
Right. So this is just closer, things that we can do in mice we couldn't do in humans, and gets a step closer, obviously, than the worm is that we work with. But that also led to some findings that I think we wouldn't have had if we'd been working in mice. Mm-hmm. But anyway, this is a good genetic model because they basically self-fertilize. Mostly they are hermaphrodites, mm-hmm. So I know deeper than you need, but
that's great.
But that allows them to be clonally the same. So all the offspring are identical to one another, whereas when you have mice, you have male, female, all varieties. Depending on how inbred they are, their genetic background will be different. Whereas these are identical one organism to the next. So that's what made them a good genetic model. And they also have behaviors. Their whole nervous system has been mapped, so we know every neuron connection in their nervous system. Anyway, it's made them a great model. And we were working with them looking at insulin responses. And we were looking at a strain that had a knockout of its insulin receptor gene. And what I noticed was that when we took them off food, so normally when you take these worms off food, and you'll see where I'm going eventually with all this. You take them off food, and so you grow them on bacteria. They feed in the soil, feed on bacteria. You take them off bacteria onto a new petri dish like you've seen in the lab, and now they will search for food. They should search for food, so they become more active. They were on food. It's like, hey, what happened? I'm off food, so they start very aggressively searching. Worms that had a knockout of their insulin receptor gene just sat there. So this was kind of odd to me. And at first you can touch them on the tail with a little pick, whatever, and they moved. So they were capable of moving, but they weren't moving. And they stayed there. We followed them over time, like 1 day, 2 days out. The worms their lifespan is about 20 days. We follow them out 10, 12, 13 days. They start to become unhealthy because there's no food, but they stayed in that same place. And so we asked, is that suicidal behavior? So they're not doing what they should do to survive.
Right.
And so we thought, well, 2 things. We can first test drugs on those animals that we would use in someone who reports to us they have suicidal ideation. And 2 of the drugs that we think of that come to mind that have shown clinically to help with that are antidepressants. And the other is clozapine, which is an antipsychotic, but has been proven in clinical trials to reduce suicidality, right? So we put the worms on those drugs, and now they moved like normal. And that didn't have to happen at all. I mean, so that already kind of alerted us that there was something interesting going on here. So then we asked, I mentioned that suicide has a strong genetic component. We know it runs in families. The heritability rates are above 50%. So that's a strong genetically based condition. And so we looked to see of those genes that have been identified as potential risk genes for suicide in these large population-wide studies, would any of those risk genes cause this same behavior in the worm? So if you knock them out in the worm, do they show this, what we eventually refer to as diminished motivation? So they're not motivated to find food when they should. So we tested 17 of those genetic knockout strains, and 10 of those showed the same behavior. And again, in other studies, we had looked at 30 or 40 strains. None of them showed this. So there was an enrichment for this behavior, suicidal behavior, diminished motivation, in those strains that had knockout of suicide risk genes. So something special was going on. So then we looked, can we correct in those worms that have knockout of suicide risk genes, can we get them back to normal with antidepressants, lithium? We tried a bunch. Clozapine,
And normal would be going to the food when they
searching for food, looking for food, and in fact we did. And some of the strains responded to all the drugs. Some responded to some drugs and not others, which kind of gets us into pharmacogenetics. And so that was what alerted us to the fact that maybe we had a model that we stumbled onto that might be relevant for suicide. And I should go back and say the starting strain that got us onto this that we stumbled onto was the lack of the insulin receptor. And turns out that people who have diabetes, have insulin deficiency or lack of insulin responsiveness, have elevations of 3 to 4-fold higher rates of depression, also suicide. So it kind of connects to what our original finding, although that is not described typically as a suicide risk gene. If you have diabetes, have insufficient insulin function, you are at risk for suicide and depression. So it does connect back in that way, even though we stumbled onto it. But anyway, we had a second behavior that we then became interested in. So the original people that described it called it social feeding, because the worms, we usually put them on a little round spot of bacteria And normally they feed what they call social feeding, and they intermingle and feed. They'll spread across the whole little lawn of bacteria. But in these so-called social feeding strains, they aggregate and clump at the edge or border of the food. And it was called social feeding, but really what they're doing, and other studies showed this, they sense that the level of oxygen is aversive to them. It's not, but they sense that because of a genetic defect. And that genetic defect, I'll stop myself here and say, is in the neuropeptide Y receptor.
Okay.
So our first strain was insulin. That's what got us onto this. The second one, the genetic defect is in neuropeptide Y receptor, or called NPY receptor. And that's interesting because, number one, it's been implicated as a risk gene for suicide. And number two, if you give neuropeptide Y to rats and mice and so forth, it's anxiolytic, so they calm down, right? It also controls their appetitive behaviors. And anyway, these, back to the social feeding. So these worms, instead of spreading out throughout the food, they aggregate in clumps. But they're doing so because they sense oxygen levels are too high. And they're not, but the oxygen levels are lower at the border of the food. They're also lower when they clump because they're consuming oxygen more. So now they're relaxed, if you will. I mean, we're interpreting that. And so we thought, do any of our suicide... And so our interpretation of this is that it's exaggerated threat assessment. So we have to have means for, looking in the environment, scanning the environment for harm. And in this case, this is this neuropeptide Y happens to be involved in oxygen sensing, among other things. And so the worms are sensing that the oxygen is a threat to them, but as I've said, it isn't. So this is an exaggerated threat response. We wondered, that sounds a little bit like, two people lose their job, right? Some of these risk factors for suicide, environmental risk factors for suicide. And you mentioned men, losing job for a man is often in our society still is a real hit to the ego. And so two people lose their job. One of them sees this as the end of the world. The other goes on Indeed or whatever job sites and starts looking for a job. And so one of those has that exaggerated threat. This is the end of the world. And so we made that connection, at least intellectually, of this gene and this system that's involved in threat assessment. It may be exaggerated in people who may have suicidal ideation. The bullying at school. Lots of kids get bullied at school. Only some of them, then will report suicidal ideation. It may be because of genes like this. And so we looked at the second behavior. And again, not all the strains showed that. We tested the same 17. 6 of those showed the social feeding. And it's a very rare phenotype. The whole world, whatever archive, only showed 5 or 6 strains that did it total before ours. So we basically doubled the number of strains that had this phenotype. And again, it was corrected by some of the drugs and not all, clozapine, amitriptyline. That, again, didn't have to be the case. So it says, here's something that we're claiming is relevant for suicidal behavior, maybe relevant for suicidal behavior, that we can build a story around that you could believe. The journal believed it when they published our work. So,
and when was this?
That was in April of this year.
Okay, that's quick.
And it took us several years of work to
recent.
But yes, exactly. But again, the fact that drugs would correct this behavior, that didn't have to be the case. And then so we got interested in thinking things like, okay, what do these genes do? And that's a different story. It's more complicated, but they generally are involved in things like fear, reward systems, diminished motivation I'd mentioned before, so motivation systems, this threat assessment. And what came out was that these are fundamental behaviors. These genes are also highly conserved. They're in C. elegans, so obviously they're conserved from them to us. That means they're highly conserved. They're doing fundamentally important things, like our drive to survive is really what we came to the conclusion about. So in a nutshell, the genes that may predispose someone to take their life are normally involved in survival strategies. And so that makes sense, I think. I mean, tell me otherwise, but if you have genes that promote your survival. Things like detecting harm in the environment or searching for food and nourishment, those kind of things. Optimizing your living conditions is another way of thinking in a nutshell what these do. And C. elegans, you take those genes away, right? Now someone is more vulnerable. They don't have that same drive to survive. The normal things that buffet us in life hit them, and they're less prepared to deal with them.
Now, are you saying that those things are passed down?
Can be, yeah. So these are genes. These would have been identified by the field as suicide risk genes.
Right.
And we collected, there have been dozens of papers written on that. So we put together like 105 genes that we found from, I think, 20 plus papers. So one paper would identify 5 risk genes, another maybe 20, and we put all those together and then saw which ones we could test in our model that I described. So yes, they can be passed down. So this is what the genetic component, or runs in families, part of suicide may relate to.
Wow.
So
that's amazing.
So that was the kind of starting point of, again, was both the end point of one process, is this a model for suicide? So in some ways it was an end point there because it all made sense to us. But then it was also a starting point for another line of thinking, and what I've started to allude to. So if these genes are meant to protect you, drive to survive, drive to optimize your living conditions, and you're not at full strength with those genes because of inheritance of what you probably have these genes but not the same complement or full expression or what have you, then you may be more vulnerable. And so going back to our story, just to pick up a little bit, we also look to see, are these expressed in human brain? And then are they in brain areas that make sense? And that was another part of the story, that yes, we saw many of these genes were co-expressed in the same neurons, same brain cells, and that they were in brain regions that we know a lot about. So these were brain areas that are involved in what I mentioned before, things like reward, fear, just generally sensing the environment. Interoception, so our internal signals, are we hungry, are we too hot, all those kind of things. So those are the brain areas. It could have been the cerebellum that mainly is involved in movement, and then you'd wonder, what's the connection there? But it wasn't. That's right. Yeah. All the brain areas that they're most highly enriched for were these areas that we know to be involved in things like motivation, reward, all that.
So there's this like self-destructiveness to lacking those genes, because this goes into like resiliency.
Yes.
And like why does one person experience a car wreck and they're fine and the other person doesn't, like you said earlier, loses the job and they don't? And we see kids who go through hard things or who are able to overcome these things. And part of the paradigm is genetics, is what you're looking at and seeing. And I think that, of course, that's been a huge question, nature versus nurture forever. And I find it that nature, I would have said early on in my career, nurture has a lot more to do with everything. And now it's like, man, there's so many things that nature plays into, having kids and them growing up and being so much like one parent than the other, or just, having the same coping skills that a parent has, even though they haven't gone through any of the same things that parent had.
Right.
And you go, man, they just were literally born with this temperament or this personality. And so what you're saying is that there's also something going on genetically within suicide, that through these worms and through this study, that we're seeing that if they don't have those particular genes and they don't have access to them, and they don't have the support from an external source because they're not generating it within themselves, then, lack of motivation, lack of connecting with other people, lack of going and finding their own food and pushing through, leads to this kind of self-destructive behavior. And I can imagine that that's the genetic component. And then as that goes on from their childhood to their teenage years to their adulthood, that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then they participate in things and act a certain way that then validates an emotional and spiritual lie that's also paired with this just genetic component. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and it becomes learned.
That's
Some
right.
of these things become learned aspects, and you mentioned like they get rewarded or not appropriately extinguished, along the way, and they become maladaptive coping skills is one way to think about some of it, right? And but there was one point I was going to come back to. Yeah, so one thing has led us in this whole series of projects to another, and the genetics was one point, and also how that. What did the diminished motivation look like? So if we go back to the second part, became translating that into the meaning for human behavior, right? So we said the diminished motivation. This would be you're no longer engaging in life, right? We ask those kind of questions when we suspect depression, right? Are you still enjoying your hobbies? Are you still going out to see friends?
Right.
And when someone answers no to those questions, it raises a red flag. We got to look into this.
Yeah.
Right. We need to look into this further. And so that's the kind of diminished motivation component. Also relates to hopelessness. So if we look at suicide, several main driving factors. From lots of studies, a big one is hopelessness. Right? When people feel hopeless, they don't see a way out, right? So is that what our worms are experiencing when they give up, right? They don't look for food when they should. They stay there till they die. Another one is burdensomeness. Are you a burden to your family? And this is what we see in the case of suicide with people with a medical condition, terminal condition or whatever, where especially males, you mentioned that before, if they get a cancer diagnosis, we got to keep a watch out if they have other risk factors for suicide because they know that financially and otherwise they may be a burden to their family. The third component that I don't have a good handle on, and we're looking into that of trying to research that, is impulsivity plays a big role as well. And this would be in the non-burdensome type of suicide, where someone have all these thoughts and they start to make a plan, but then ultimately at that last moment, right, their logical thinking is overwhelmed. Right? They're not thinking logically. They're not thinking about the future. They're not really thinking about the consequences. And so, and again, genetic and other studies have shown impulsivity is I'm not, I didn't just make that up for today or whatever. It's something that's out there, but that's a harder one to handle because that's ultimately at that time where the person's gone silent or not talking to a family member, and that impulsivity. And because of that, you can either be logical thinking or emotional. You can't be both at the same time. And this is that kind of thing. Someone's an emotional, they're basically their limbic system, their amygdala, and that's where we found a lot of these risk genes, and that's one of the brain areas that the amygdala was rich for these suicide risk genes. So now they're just thinking emotionally without any kind of higher order logic, reasoning, and that's a tough part.
Yeah, is there a component where this lack of receptor and gene affects the prefrontal that kind of get the left and right brain to talk?
I don't know. I mean, the worms can't tell us that.
Sure.
There are things they can tell us, and they've told us a lot. And
What do you
lots of
think?
good clues.
I'm asking, really.
Well, I think that it may be what it's saying is that the basic functions that these genes are involved in, the survival genes, are more fundamental. They're hindbrain, that kind of part of our brain. And so it may be that you're overly focused on those type of activities, brain activities and brain processes. And so the prefrontal cortex is just hanging out there with nothing to do. So it's not that some of them could affect that. I don't discount that. But from our part of the story, at least so far with what we've seen with these particular subset of risk genes, not all the risk genes, but a subset of risk genes, would tell us the story of you become just a ball of emotions. You're not going to, the worm is just not looking out, exaggerating the threat that's out there. It's not doing the things it should do at a fundamental level to survive. And so that paints a little bit different picture than it's just that the frontal cortex is.
Yeah, I was thinking, how does that relate relationally with, I think about humans, and I think we're so relational, right?
Right.
And the same things that can alleviate anxiety and depression and suicidality come from other people. You know, the connection that we have with other people, the feeling of being seen and feeling known, you know, those things increase brain activity and increase methylate and, you know, these different things that help heal the brain. And of course, medication also, you know, is what we're talking about. You know, you drip the medication on these worms and you saw them interact. What do you think about a difference in, like, is a worm the same thing as a human in the sense of communal living and survival? You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, they do have pheromones. They have lots of signals that do tell them, and they change their behavior depending on density of the population. So they have lots of the signaling pathways that we have, the same hormones and such that control some of that. So,
but do the other worms, you know, if this worm is, let's say they don't have the gene, they have the gene problem, you know, you drop the food, they don't go for it. Do, in a sense, humans can see that, come over and react with connection and community to get that worm to engage. I mean, some animals do this, right? Monkeys, you know, dolphins. I mean, you know, different animals kind of commune and save each other from the whale or whatever. Obviously, worms are a lower level of, like, creation, but it's just, I'm just thinking out loud, like, medication isn't the only thing that helps the brain in those gene healing spaces in humanity.
Right. And there are certain things we can't address in this model.
No, of course, yeah.
But I think, but I will also say that only because we were looking at this model did we make this connection that, hey, these genes are survival genes.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental point of why we have them. And then why they might be, you know, when we don't have adequate function of those genes, then that may lead us to not have adequate drive to survive.
Yeah.
So we would have only seen that had we been, you wouldn't have been able to do these same studies in a mouse.
Oh, it's crazy. I think that's so cool.
Yeah. So, and then the last thing we can discuss many other things, but the last point I wanted to make was, so we started this, as I've already mentioned, how would you translate that into what a human feels or experiences, like the exaggerated threat, you lose your job and one's kind of okay with it, the other really freaks out, those kind of things. But the other thing that this brought to mind was that we treat suicide in such a stigmatized way. And through this whole process, it became clear to me that really and truly we should think of suicide as nothing different than a brain tumor. So I'll let you think about that for a second, and then I'll kind of go through why I say that. And
yeah, nothing different than a brain tumor. Let me think about that. So, I mean, I can assume where you're going to go.
But
go with it.
Yeah.
And we'll chop it up.
And the idea being, you know, we in psychiatry talk a good game, like, you know, addiction is a disease. And when to some degree we believe that, still in lots of ways we don't. You know, the way AA handles it is not really a medical model. And I'm not saying it's not effective for people, but I'm just saying that it's really not a medical model.
Yeah.
So we say, oh, addiction is a disease, but then we have these other, it's character, it's, you know, all these other things. And that really is true of, so in something like addiction, we've made some progress seeing it as a disease, but we're not there all the way.
Do you think we should see it only as a disease?
In some ways, yeah. So let me get back to my model.
Hear.
So with suicide, why I compare it to a brain tumor, and we don't, you know, like the family is devastated, you know, what did we do wrong, you know, and how could the person who killed themselves do that to us, right? So there's anger at them, there's blame and guilt on the part of the family. We've discussed this in our department. There's blame and guilt on the part of the clinician who saw the kid or whatever adult who winds up dying by suicide. And, you know,
if you're a clinician long enough, it's going to happen. So
it absolutely will. And so back to the tumor analogy, you know, with a brain tumor, not all brain tumors are treatable, right? We do our best, and they're not all treatable. The same is true of someone who has suicidal ideation. They may not respond to your antidepressant. They may not respond to your psychotherapy, whatever we throw at them, just as a brain tumor may not respond to chemotherapy, radiation therapy, resection, all those kind of things. So there is that parallel that we should say right from the start. But then there are others, both emerge from biology and genetics. This is what we've talked about here today. In both cases, there can be some kind of exposure, so the environment plays a role. In the case of a brain tumor, we think something like exposure to a carcinogen, maybe, let's say. In the case of suicide, it may be exposure to things like trauma, right, and stress in general, even more broadly. And
You're saying that sets the epigenetic markers off?
Well, I'm just saying the parallel. If we just focus on the parallel now for how is suicide really like a brain tumor or not? So they're both biologically and genetically driven. What I just said there, they both may have an environmental component, and that one component, the components differ. You know, a carcinogen is definitely different than trauma, but that's just how how we sense trauma is like the cell experiences a carcinogen. They're both biological systems dealing with something coming at them that altered them in some way, that put them on a path, one towards a tumor, one towards suicidal ideation.
Yeah, but we're also saying that this genetic marker for suicidality, and if we use the worms, for example, make them not go and eat, regardless of the environment, or the oxygen, for example, that they think that the oxygen is low, but it's really not. Isn't that the same thing as because trauma isn't like, you know this, I'm just talking to the people listening. Trauma isn't like this like invisible thing. There's an event or a thing that happened, right? An environmental factor, but most of the time humans are involved, you know. Right. I mean, it could be weather related, but there's usually an external source that is creating pain in the person. They're harming them. They're saying something to them. They're threatening their life. And that is their experience of that is the trauma.
Yes. And there can be other stressors, you know, that don't even have to be that magnitude.
Sure, but my question is when it comes to genetics, in the same way that this gene is setting up, it's like, well, why can someone be spanked by their parent and hit by their parent and abused by their parent, and they don't completely collapse and go into suicide where somebody else does?
Okay, that's the third part.
Okay.
So I've got a couple more.
Yeah. This is good.
Parallels. One would be resilience. So we have resilience of the immune system, and that's something that gets out of whack in the case of brain tumor. And then we have resilience of our coping system. So I'm giving you, several parallels, and got a couple more to go through. And so that would feed into what you just said. Two kids, one gets hit by the parent, and the other one and responds poorly. The other one goes through the same trauma, even maybe more, and yet they come out the other side. So part of that could be genetics. Part of it could be the resilience, which part of that is genetics. Part of it is learned, right? We learn our coping skills, or we don't. I mean, some people never really develop coping skills well because it's not like we teach kids at school.
Amen.
Right? It's not something.
Let me get on a soapbox about that.
It's not something we do as parents, in most cases, intentionally, right? And so we're left.
We should.
Yes, we should. Absolutely. I'm big on that, and we're on the same page there. But again, we have, these different resiliency levels in the tumor. Lack of resilience helps the tumor develop and grow. Lack of resilience here helps the suicidal ideation grow, if we want to think of it that way. Then a fourth parallel would be at some point the system is overwhelmed. In the case of the brain tumor, the growth is too much, it's overgrown, and now the organism's integrity is at stake. And in the case of suicidal ideation, again, the system is overwhelmed, right? There's feelings of hopelessness and so forth. And in this case, there's an existential threat. And lastly, we have that again, trying to keep these parallels. In the case of the tumor, we have evasion of control by the immune system. So we know the immune system surveils and can take care of tumors of a certain size up to a point. But at some point that gets the system overwhelmed. Tumors are tricky. They also intentionally evade this immune system. And on the case of the suicidal ideation, we have evasion of I mentioned before about the impulsivity of our survival systems, of our logical thinking. And so when that breaks down, then again, someone may consider that last step. They've had suicidal ideation because of the above factor, genetics, lack of resilience and trauma, so forth. But ultimately, it may come down to that evasion of control by the things, the systems that keep us alive. And the genetics, as I've already explained, can affect that, right?
Yeah.
But it can go beyond that as well, that impulsive behavior. We've had the discussion about, is the prefrontal cortex involved and to what degree? And at that last moment, I think we can safely say it's not involved, right?
I don't think you'd kill yourself if your prefrontal was working really well.
Yeah, I believe that to be true.
Yeah.
And what's the best model for learning about that? I don't know. That's something we're still working on. But anyway, so if we believe what we should believe, especially as physicians, clinicians, and so forth, in biological model, the brain tumor should be no different. And the response to, when someone has a 14-year-old that has a brain tumor and they go through chemotherapy and all these things and ultimately nothing works, right? Everyone's sad. We don't blame the family. We don't blame the person when they go. We're not angry at them, right? We're not really blaming the clinicians. We wish they had better tools, but we're not really blaming. They did all they could. That's not how we react when the 14-year-old kills himself, right? We're looking at the family like, what did they do? They must have really beaten that kid or done some things. And a lot of times when you go back and sort it out, that's not the case at all. And it can be because that kid had this exaggerated threat assessment. They're bullied at school like lots of kids, which shouldn't happen, but it happens. But they react differently to it. Their resiliency wasn't there, all those other things. But we treat them entirely differently. So if we're really walking the walk and talking the talk of what we believe in medical models and this type of thing, we would be treating suicidal deaths by suicide very, very differently than we do today. And so that's part of my point and message I would like to get across, because it should change the way a family views that situation. They've lost a loved one. When you lose a loved one to brain tumor, that takes a while to heal. And it may never fully heal. I mean, those are tough to go through, no doubt. But at least you're not saddling yourself with guilt. Or what I've seen, lots of families split after, especially a kid, whatever, teen, whatever, dies by suicide. The one person's blaming the other. It was because of the mother's blaming the father, all those kind of things. These are traumas to go through. If we truly looked at it no differently than a brain tumor, it would be a sad experience to go through, but it would be very different, and we could go through it in a much more healthy fashion and how we grieve and how we treat that situation. So I'm hoping that it's kind of focusing on the genetics, having the genetics tell us about the biology, having the biology maybe shifting the paradigm of how we think about suicide. This may help us all in dealing with it, the clinicians who wind up having to deal with it, as well as the families.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that looking at our response to suicide or our response to addiction, looking at the genetics that are, kind of predisposed in human beings and not having judgment toward those things is super important. I mean, when you see a person, I think one of the beauties of being a counselor is, when I work with people and I hear their story, it's never that I go, oh, that doesn't make sense. Whatever the terrible thing that nobody understands is, it's like once you hear their story, it makes perfect sense. So I say that to say, I agree, and I definitely think that our response as clinicians and our response to people and humans when suicide happens, or even depression happens, or anxiety, is to initially say, well, where's your sin? What did you do wrong? Instead of, showing grace and trying to understand. I want to understand more. I guess the word that I think of when you say, it's a biological is it's only a biological.
No.
Yeah. And I know you're saying it's not.
Yeah. So
the question for me as a clinician is, when I'm sitting with a family, if it's only a medical model, if I look at suicidality like I look at a brain tumor, then there's never a conversation about what could have been done differently.
Well, no, I think that's not, the clinicians who are treating the brain tumor, they try this first and that doesn't work. And if they have an experimental new drug, they'll say, well, let's get this person on this experimental new drug. So we're having those same conversations that there are different things we need to do and try.
Yeah, but there's not a human element in that in a brain tumor because there are things that family members can and can't do that are traumas, that are neglect, that are unsupportive of somebody with a gene predisposition for suicidality. Are we saying that's not true?
No, but what I would say there is that we have to recognize that there are going to be cases that no matter what we do,
100%,
that person is going to die from suicide. And so that's we act like, every person we could have gotten back from that edge.
That's good. That's good. I hear what you're saying.
And that's not the case.
That's right. So
that is not the case.
So it's not only medical.
Right.
But if it is only medical, there are some people who are, no matter how loving their parents are, no matter how supportive they are, no matter how attuned they are, because of this predisposition, you're saying it's inevitable that they'll kill themselves?
Well, there are some that are going to, despite our best, just as some die from tumors, despite all of our efforts. We have to, if we really are honest about this and apply this model, then we have to say there are some who are not going to survive their situation, the genes, the environment, all these other things, and our best attempts are going to fail. And we have to be willing to admit that. Now, we can't predict who that is, right? So we have to treat everyone to the last moments that we have a shot at it, right? And a lot of people are silent about this and will go silent when they're really getting deep in their plotting taking their life and that kind of thing. So they get quiet, and we it makes it more difficult to help them. But throughout that process, we do as much as we can because we can't predict who is and who isn't going to take their life.
What population of size do you think it is, people who have these predispositions for suicide?
Well, there's a large number that have a predisposition, but if you mean the ones that are kind of the terminal case of suicide, it's whatever the numbers are, pretty close to whoever dies by suicide. Right, so whatever those numbers are, what percentage that is.
So you're saying
probably
that everybody
close.
who dies by suicide is going to be the same number of people who always were going to die by suicide?
And that may be shrunk a little bit because some don't seek help, right? Some never really try or follow through with attempts to help them. So there's some of that population. Yeah, I don't deny. There are members who aren't, but I'm just saying there is a subfraction of the population of people who have died by suicide that no matter what we did, it was going to be that outcome. No matter what we did, they would find a way. They would resist help. They don't have the resiliency. They don't have the drive to survive from their genes.
So there's no hope for those people.
Just like there isn't in the tumor. If we're really honest about it.
I'm asking, yes.
Yeah, I'd say yes. I'd say yes, exactly.
Huh.
But that's not the whole fraction of people who die by suicide because, as I said, some never seek help or they don't adequately, you don't go through adequate trials of medications, adequate trials of psychotherapy, whatever, behavioral therapy, whatever it might be called for.
Well, why would those things, if it's just a medical model, besides medication, why would any kind of therapy help?
Well, just like a tumor. Some drugs helped it and some drugs didn't. Tumor resection, in some cases, the surgery takes care of it. We get the whole tumor, great. And then when it doesn't, then, we'll try chemotherapy. This is the same deal.
Yeah, but those are external chemicals that we're attacking a medical thing. A tumor is a medical issue that we're taking a drug to attack with. It's not relational. Are you saying that if you love someone and hug them enough, their tumor will go away?
No, what I'm saying is we have a different modality. Yes, those kind of things are important to keep someone from becoming suicidal, to show them there is hope.
Does that help?
It does help, yeah.
So it can prevent suicide?
It can decrease suicide, for sure, but it's not going to prevent every case of suicide.
Okay, yeah, I'm with you on you're saying it's not going to prevent every case. But there are cases in which, had they gotten loved and affection and care and encouragement and hope, that it prevents suicide. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, at some stages along the way, For sure, yeah. I mean, otherwise we would never even try. I mean, these therapies do help. I'm not denying that. I'm
Yeah,
just
that's
saying
what I'm asking
that
you,
there's
though, is
oh,
that-
absolutely. You know, and it's
So is it that the people who were always destined to get, die because they have this gene didn't get the help they needed? Or is it that they got, some of them, like you said, were offered the help and the support, but then just didn't get it? The reason I'm saying this is that I feel like we live in a culture where we suck at caring for people in general.
we do.
So it's like we're doing this research based on a culture that is horrible at caring for people's emotions and horrible at parenting. Like, just in general, like, the research shows it that parents suck. Like, they're not doing a good job. Nobody helped them. So I'm not hating on parents. If you're listening to this, I'm sorry. We all suck. But like, we just live in a culture where emotional intelligence and support and connection and community is like, bye-bye.
Yeah.
So if that has nothing to do with it.
Oh, no, it does.
Okay.
It does. That's one of those factors. I mentioned the environmental exposure. You get a carcinogen in the case of the brain tumor. You have trauma. You have poor, neglect or abuse. Worse in the case of upbringing. And then if you, like I say, we don't teach coping skills. So all those things come into play. So maybe a starting point to get someone, pull them back from the edge of suicide, coping skills. Hug. Giving them that, make them feel that things aren't hopeless. Those things absolutely work. They're just not going to work in every single case.
Okay. So, and how do we know that?
Well, if you believe in this medical model, then there are cases where this is no different than a brain tumor. The best, everything we try, there have been, psychiatrists take their own life, right?
Sure.
Psychiatrists commit suicide. Well, if they're not equipped to deal with it, then how can we ever hope for the rest of us to have a shot, right?
Yeah, but that's like, I'm sorry, but if you took like the population of psychiatrists and you said how many of them had like a healthy childhood and had healthy functioning lives, that's not a very good statistic, as it is for any group of people.
Right. But, the coping skills and all those resilience, all those things are playing a big role. But there are also genetic factors that determine that.
But don't we think that those, like a hug, right? Hugging people releases oxytocin. So there's always a medical chemical body response to relationship.
Right, but if your oxytocin receptor didn't work very well, right, that hug doesn't mean the same thing to you.
That's good. That's a good point. Yeah. So if they literally don't have the genetic ability to receive those things and that make a change, those are the people who you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly. Yes, you defined exactly that. And so it's saying there are lots of people who die by suicide that we could have done some things differently about.
Okay, now you're saying
right?
that.
But
because you're saying that's what.
The person has to be involved in that as well, because I think we as clinicians probably, if they came to us honestly and said, "I've got suicidal ideation," we would have done everything that we could do, right?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is you think the majority of people, and not you think, but also the research, you think that the majority of people who commit suicide, the majority of them are the ones who, no matter what you did, would have committed suicide, or that there are children and people who have this gene and have this predisposition for it, and then they go through neglect and trauma and a lack of care and a lack of like a sense of identity and a sense of safety, and that jacks that gene up even more and makes them more predisposed to it. And then after a decade or more of, not getting what they needed and basically getting emotionally beat up for their whole life, like, yeah, they get some therapy and they get some hugs and people tell them that, but it's not enough to overcome like the years of.
Right. That's some fraction of the people who die by suicide that fall into that category. There's, it's a, kind of a bell-shaped curve. Here's the population of people who die by suicide. And out here on one end are the ones who would, no matter what you did, no matter.
Sure, I agree. I hear you at least.
And then there are some out here that would have responded had they been honest about, right, that I'm having suicidal ideation. Because that's the other thing people know, especially teenagers, I'm going to get hospitalized, right, if I tell them I've got suicidal thoughts. Uh-huh. And then how do you explain to your classmates when you come back from being hospitalized for 2 weeks, what that was about?
Right,
So,
but wouldn't that go into having a lack of like parents that teach you about your emotions and that you might have suicidal thoughts and like setting you up to the fact that like this is normal and part of it and you don't need to be scared of that, and you having a relationship with parents where you can talk about feelings and emotions?
absolutely. No, we, in many ways, way back to what you're saying, and I agree with our society, we set people up for failure.
Yeah, okay, that's
right.
It's just if you say that this suicidality gene, when people commit suicide, that the response to the family should never be.
I don't say never.
Okay, well, we kind of started off with people say, "What could you have done differently?" and they couldn't have done anything differently.
For some fraction of those, absolutely.
So that's what I'm just clarifying.
Yeah,
As a clinician, there have been a million times where I'm working with somebody who commits suicide, and it's the figuring out if there was or wasn't anything that they could have done differently, so that we can help other people who are struggling with suicidality. That's important. To be able to look at someone's life and go, "Oh yeah, man, like I totally neglected them for 10 years."
Mm-hmm.
And then they were suicidal. They didn't tell me. And then now we just started trying to help them for a year and they committed suicide. Like that's a big problem that needs to be accepted. I mean, the person who's neglected the kid who killed himself needs to forgive themselves. They need to recognize like they're human and give themselves grace and do all that work. But there is some responsibility in that for the person. If a dad beat his son for 12 years and then that kid kills himself.
Well, their kids get beat. They don't, commit suicide.
Right, but we'd have to see why that is. It's not just a genetic component.
Yeah, no, I've said genes, environment, coping systems, all those kind of things play a role. And which one they're weighted differently in the different individuals.
I agree, but if we say that, it's just genetics.
No.
And it's like a brain tumor.
Yep.
That's what I'm saying. You're comparing it to a brain tumor. A brain tumor is just genetics.
No, it's environment. I said, you get a carcinogen exposure, your immune system plays a role. The immune system could be like parents. Were they there,
So you do think that matters, that somebody whose parents don't love them in the way that they should, it affects their body in a way that it produces cancer?
No, what I was saying is that the immune system, if we think of the immune system like a parent, the immune system's there trying to, protect them, from the tumor. The first couple of tumor cells come along, the immune system can deal with them. The kid is experiencing some trauma, the parent is there to help them deal with it. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, we have systems that are set up to prevent some kind of outcome, harm in this case, or a tumor in this case. And they have many parallels. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the parents aren't the immune system. The immune system isn't the parent. They're just within the domain in which they operate. This is a biological system. This is a complex biological, psychological system. Mm-hmm. And that's where, the model is not, or the analogy is not 100%, because psychology is nothing to a tumor, though we know that if you're stressed, you can increase your rate of tumors.
That's what I was saying, yes.
So there are even some parallels there, but they're not, it breaks down a little bit if we could, try and dig too deep or put it under too fine of a microscope. But it's also to say that because we stigmatize suicide, someone won't talk about it.
Yes, I agree, and I think that's the the point we started with, is that regardless of what category of people you are in this research, let's say you're the kid or the adult who was, as you're saying, predestined based on your genetics, and nothing was ever going to help you, right? Maybe there's, in the brokenness of humanity, there are people whose genes predispose them to be set up for tumors. They take the chemo, they do the things, they eat well, they have a loving family, but their body just can't sustain it for the reasons of things passed down, all their race, their ethnicity, their culture, all those things just set them up to where, hey man, we did the best we could, but the cancer's getting you no matter what.
Right.
That's the thing. Or there's somebody who has the predisposition for cancer. Their parents smoke cigarettes. their parents are stressing them out. Their parents aren't educated enough to know to look for these markers in their body. So they eat the wrong foods, they have the wrong environment, and that festers and festers and festers. Could have been prevented, could have been reduced.
At some level, right?
What do you mean?
No, I mean, it's not a guarantee.
Well,
but
no,
yeah,
I'm not
what
saying
you're
it's a
saying,
guarantee,
what you're
but-
saying is true.
Okay.
Yes, that with a better diet, with less exposure to, again, I mentioned that you have exposure to carcinogen. You mentioned smoking. Resiliency of the systems, resiliency of the immune system. That would be things like, do they have an adequate diet? So those things are.
Yeah, what do they listen to?
Are
What do they
they-
watch? What kind
yeah.
of belief systems do they have?
Right, and those all are weighted. So I when you keep saying, I'm saying it's only genetics and biology, and it's not. I've mentioned it's
No,
environmentology, and then it's weighted, right? Like in someone with a really strong genetic component, the rest of it may not matter as much. In other words, that's why I say exaggerated threat detection. They get some slight in the schoolyard, and they go home and they just ruminate on it, whereas the other kid doesn't because they don't have that strong genetic dose. Whereas the other has a weaker genetic dose, but they suffered a lot of trauma.
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
So you can get there in lots of different ways, but
For sure.
it involves these kind of pathways that we can think of. We can medicalize them in a way to avoid stigmatizing.
Yeah, and I'm hearing you. So you have that group, you have the middle group, and then you have the third group, and none of those groups, when suicidality happens, should our first initial response be, "What did you do wrong?"
Right.
That's not helpful to anybody with any problem. And I think that you're 100% right in that if we can have a medical model and see that, let's start with genetics playing a huge part, and that those genetics were setting that ball down the hill, so to speak, then I do think it destigmatizes it because we can start earlier. And this is what my question to you would be. We talked about this with schizophrenia on the last podcast, I think. And it's going, how do we assess for that earlier on so that we can start to help these kids sooner if they have a predisposition for suicidality?
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, we'd have you have, they used to have, I don't know if they have any of this anymore, like fitness test when you were in school,
Yeah.
right? Can a kid do some push-ups or whatever?
But we do this for cancer.
Yeah, but I'm saying we should have kids that have a coping skills test when you're in fifth
Yes.
grade or whatever, something like that.
I agree.
If we did that, then we'd know that we had done truly everything we could as a society, and the number of people dying from suicide is probably going to shrink. It's not going to go away completely.
Well, yeah,
But it would shrink.
We're doing, I talk about this all the time in my talks, but we have this, Mission 22 nonprofit that helps veterans. 22 veterans a day kill themselves, and it's been around for almost 2 decades, and it's still called Mission 22. Mm-hmm. Like, why are we not reducing that number? That's my,
That's back to my point. There's some that it's inevitable, sadly to say. No matter what we try, it's all these things are stacked up against them. It's a combination of genes, environment, resiliency, lack of coping skills.
Yeah, I think that's a small number.
Yeah.
In the scope of people who commit suicide, I think there are, just like with cancer, I'm sure there are people that, I don't know. I don't know if I can agree. I don't know if I believe people are predestined to get cancer or to get a suicidality gene, and that no matter what kind of care they get, that they, I do think that might be possible based on the broken fallenness of the world, because people get cancer and die and they did everything right. But I do think within the scope of everybody who dies of suicide, I'm asking, it sounds like you're saying the research is there is a population there, but it's a small percentage of the population of suicidality.
Yeah, because we don't know, like some of those people that die by suicide have never spoken to anyone about it.
Sure.
Right. So we never were able to throw any thing at them that might have pulled them back from the brink, whatever that would be.
But if we look in their life
therapy.
and their parents, do we see that they had a good life and that their parents were kind and connected and in a community and,
In some cases, that's why I say when you have exaggerated threat detection, the oxygen level isn't harmful to the worm. Mm-hmm. But they think it is, and they're doing all they can to survive that. And you could have some kid that, growing up, their parents corrected them once or twice, and they just didn't think they deserved it. And if they have that right genetic set point, an outsider would say, that's not abuse, that wasn't trauma,
Sure.
right? but that's how they experienced
And we see that.
it.
Yeah, for sure. That happens.
Right. And that's how they experienced it.
Yeah.
We can't get inside their head, especially if they don't communicate with us and say, that really is not, here's trauma. This is what your parents correcting you over this or that was not trauma. But nevertheless, they've experienced it in that way because of genetics, learned behavior. I want to take, focus too much like it's all genetics. It's not all genetics by any means. That's just that opened this door to us to be able to see things in a little bit different way. If the genes can do this, and they're doing this at fundamental level, they're affecting our survival strategies, then when you take those away, our survival strategies aren't what we need maybe to cope.
Yeah. I don't want to lose that point. I think that's great. And again, I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just thinking about it out loud.
No, that's good. Good thoughts.
I'm just trying to, as a clinician and for me as a Christian too, just thinking about, the suffering in the world and I think where we're aligned is whether it's cancer or whether it's a suicide gene, if there's a biological component, which there is to all of these things we're talking about. If we did a Venn diagram, there's always a biological component.
Right.
And the beauty of relationships with humans is that the way in which we care for one another and love one another impacts that biology.
Yes.
Both positive and negative.
Right.
Right. So we know that. We can measure that in science, that people who are loved on and cared for, the hormones that are released, the methylate that's released, those things heal the brain and can restore things. That's why therapy works. Mm-hmm. It's why people can sit in a room and talk, feel better, release the right chemicals. Why exercising and running releases endorphins. Like the physical part of us and the relational part of us impact the biology.
Absolutely. In fact, we have a whole other paper related to the genetics because one of the things that people try to do, so let's say you've got genes that predispose you, since we've been talking about suicide, to suicide. So you can sequence someone's genome and say, okay, you have a risk marker here in your genome. Your control group doesn't have those same risk markers. And we're going to sequence the genomes of 10 people, and we find someone who has a high score of all those risk genes. You can assign a score. They call it polygenic risk score, polygenic score. So if the more of those risk markers you have, nucleotide changes, whatever they are in the genome, things we can measure, you'd say you've got a higher risk score. And we're trying to do that for schizophrenia. Can we predict someone who may get schizophrenia? Mm-hmm. And what we're saying is, no matter how hard you try to do that and figure that out, there is situational gene regulation. So those little markers can only express, most of the cases, they don't change the protein, right, that they code for, that the gene codes for. They affect its expression level. Mm-hmm. So how much of it is made. Too much is made, too little is made. And so the polygenic risk score just say you have a risk factor there. What we say is there's situational gene regulation. So we know that there are transcription factors in the brain that respond to exactly what you're saying. They respond to stress. They can respond to positive emotions. And those transcription factors can affect the level of that gene being expressed.
Okay.
So if you don't take that into account, right, it was something we can't really take into account. What do? Do a brain scan of someone while they're behaving and then find out, that you just upregulated your risk gene. Uh-huh. Don't do that, right? That's a thought experiment. Yeah. That you could try to do. But we know that our thought processes, rumination, I mentioned, our depressive thoughts or positive thoughts, can change expression levels of genes, risk genes for hypertension, risk genes for cardiovascular disease. But studies are pretty solid making those kind of connections. And so it's even more complicated than I've said because, yes, the genes are there, the environment is there, but then you can have this situational gene regulation where, depending if you're thinking positively, thinking negatively, this may shift the level of those risk genes to either provide you more support that you need or less support to survive or to get schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or so forth.
Yeah, that's
Does
good.
That make sense? So
no, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're, as we're talking about it, we're landing on the same page and saying the same things. I just, wanted to clarify that and think about that out loud because this is to me, it's a fun discussion. I like kind of throwing it around and externalizing because you know a lot more than I do about the genetic part. And, I'm just clarifying what the research is saying, because I don't want people to feel like there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I don't want people to shame people when things happen.
Right.
So trying to figure out how to make both of those things happen.
Yeah, it's a destigmatization. And I think I can be overly aggressive by saying this is exactly like a brain tumor in every way, because I want it to be destigmatized.
Yeah, and I do too.
And, I think about this down at our own medical school. They used to have student mental health was on campus, and they moved it off. Why would you move it off? Because it's a stigma.
Mm-hmm.
If you had diabetes, you'd go up to the third floor, same building, get your test done or whatever, go to our clinic that, deals with that. Student mental health, hush, hush, got to go someplace else. So we're medical professionals, and we are self-stigmatizing.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. There's a fine line between hiding it and then going, hey, let's change the culture to where we're all okay with seeing it.
Yep.
Exactly. And I think that's the goal of my practice, is to go, hey, we all need therapy.
Yeah.
There's nothing better than, me seeing a head pastor of a church and, or a member of a church and them struggling with coming to therapy. And then we walk out in the waiting room and their pastor is there.
Yeah.
Coming in after them,
Yeah.
or they're the business owner that they look up to, or the, the head coach of this school, or the, whoever that is they think would never need therapy.
Right.
Is sitting in the waiting room. And that's beautiful to me, because it's like, man, and I tell my clients, I go to counseling, like, we all need it. And so I'm with you. I think, it is definitely more of a medical problem than we give it credit to. And that is an issue, is that people think it's mainly
right.
what the parents did, or mainly. Yes. And I do think that each case is, I would say it's a case by case basis. That's why that's why I love doing counseling, is because we get to figure it out together. And what I would love to see is a world, and I'm sure this is what you're pushing towards, a world in which, like, we do the same thing with predispositions for kids for ADHD, for autism, for, when you're having a baby, not as much anymore, but I remember they called us and said, hey, we did this panel and your kid is really, susceptible to having autism or something else, some other deformity. And we freaked out for like 2 weeks. Then we went and read the research, and it was like, well, if they fall over this category, they're going to tell you that they're a risk, even though it's very unlikely. It's that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, well, what do we need to do? What vitamins do we need to eat? How do we need to, do the best we can to tackle this predisposition? And so I think what you're doing is beautiful, because it's saying, hey, there is a predisposition for suicidality in our biology. It's not just that parents suck and aren't doing the right things, or that this person went through a trauma, or that this thing is, their life is difficult, or they're weak, or whatever. There was this thing we missed that then, the lack of care of the environment, I call it like a dial, it's like skewed it one way or the other.
Right.
And each case is different. I think what you're saying is there are some cases that we don't want parents to feel like, had they just loved their kid more, they wouldn't have killed themselves.
Right.
Or had they loved their husband more, had he prayed more, went to church more, or done something in his own moral code more, it would have prevented it, because sometimes those genes and those markers, just like a cancer, there's just the brokenness of the world. It's too much all at once, and that overrides any kind of like choice.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And ability to pull things back from the brink.
Right. And so instead of going, hey, they should have done something different and they would have killed themselves, it's like, hey, there was something medical going on and we did the best we could. And so instead of blaming and shaming everybody around them, let's look in our own lives where we can take better care and, assess our medical issues and destigmatize, this stuff, so that the suicide doesn't then extrapolate into even more problems and damage and trauma for everybody around them.
Right, exactly. Like I say, couples splitting and such because their kid, all those things happen.
That's great.
Yep.
I didn't push you too hard, huh?
No, not at all. No, it's good to be pushed.
Yeah, I like it. It's good stuff. I mean, it's very helpful. I think what you're doing is beautiful, and I think that, the research and the backing and, this is why our society, functions at a higher rate and we're able to care for people. I love that, the coping skills and the care that we put in for children with both schizophrenia and suicide, like those are really, really important. And I want people to go, hey, I don't want them to think, oh, it's just medical, so it doesn't matter what we do, because that's the other side of the coin.
Right.
You
No,
know?
I'm part of that. Yeah, I said coping skills
Yeah.
versus, resilience, those types of things are very important. But there are genes for things like rumination, resilience.
Oh, yeah.
Also, it's not that everything, I'm not trying to get everything back to being,
Yeah.
genetic or biologic, but just remember too that,
It's all
your
connected.
resiliency, your ability to ruminate, all those kind of things, we know there are genes that can, lead someone to do more or less of those types of counterproductive behaviors.
Yeah. I think that my hope for people is that they find those things out in relationship. They go see a psychiatrist, they go see their doctor, they go see a therapist, they go see their pastor, and they go, hey, I'm struggling with these things. What is the major driver here? Mm-hmm. If it's genetic, let's get some meds. Let's get the genetic help that we need. And let's also do the emotional, physical stuff that I need. Let's eat better. Let's work out. Let's be in community, and find out which one is really, really pushing this. Maybe you've taken the medication and you're feeling better, but you're doing none of the self-care and none of the self-love and none of the community that you need. It's like, it's inevitably going to lead that direction if you don't do, the full gamut. Yeah. And then lastly, when it does happen inevitably, when somebody does take their own life and you look and you go, we did everything that we possibly could, you might have.
Right. Absolutely.
And don't beat yourself up.
Yes.
and realize that, like with cancer and a tumor, you gave all the medication, you did the chemo, you did the radiation, you ate better, you stopped eating gluten, whatever, and the cancer came back. And in this person, it didn't. And it's like, well, why is that? Well, there's a bunch of reasons that we have to work out through counseling and through care that we can figure that out. But I would say that for anybody, it doesn't mean that they are less lovable and less worthy of care and concern.
Right. And I think the destigmatization is the biggest thing, because someone's not going to show up at the clinic. Someone's not going to, make that effort if we continue to have such a strong stigma that we have.
I agree. Yeah, pointing at them with, well, if you wouldn't have done this, what did you do? It's like, that's my whole shtick, is trying to get people to destigmatize coming and getting help. So I'm with you, man.
Great.
It's good stuff. Appreciate you.
Yep.
Thanks for listening,
Thanks.
guys. I hope this was thought-provoking and brain-stimulating. And, Dr. Dwyer's going to come out with all kinds of, great research to help suicidality. We want our people to stay alive. We want people to live flourishing lives in our community, because we all are needed. And the Bible says when one suffers, we all suffer. And so we want people to get help. So keep listening and keep getting help. God bless.